Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our interpreter instructions.
Buenas tardes a todos. Soy Lars y junto con Abraham representamos la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje Tilde. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea entre el inglés y el español. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lars, and together with Abraham, we represent the Tilde Language Justice Cooperative. We will be providing simultaneous interpretation between English and Spanish. Esta reunión será bilingüe. Si usted domina ambos el inglés y el español, no tiene que hacer nada, pero si prefiere el español, por favor seleccione el canal de español. Si usa una computadora, haga clic en el globito con interpretación, o si está usando la aplicación de Zoom en su teléfono o tableta, haga clic en los tres puntitos, luego interpretación de idiomas, luego español y finalizado. Desafortunadamente, no se puede acceder a interpretación a través de los Chromebooks y aparatos de Linux. Today's session will be held bilingually. If you're comfortable with both Spanish and English, you don't need to do anything. But if you prefer to use English, please make sure to select the English channel. If you're using a computer, click on the globe icon that says Interpretation. Or if you're using the Zoom app on your phone or tablet, click on the three dots, then Language Interpretation, then English, then Done. Interpretation is unfortunately not available on Chromebooks or Linux-based devices. Unos breves recordatorios para que promovamos juntos un espacio de la justicia del lenguaje. Por favor, silencie su micrófono cuando no esté hablando. Si no domina el inglés, sintoniza la interpretación con sus controles de Zoom para participar plenamente. Y si sintoniza un canal de lenguaje, favor de hablar solamente el idioma de tal canal. Pedimos también a todas las presentadoras que hablen claro y despacio, especialmente si están leyendo. Y favor de hablar solo un idioma por intervención o frase. A couple quick reminders to help us build a space of language justice together. Please mute your mic when you're not speaking. If you're not comfortable communicating in Spanish, be sure to connect to an interpretation channel so you can participate fully. And if you do join a language channel, please only speak that language. We also ask all presenters to speak slowly and clearly, especially if you're reading. And please speak only one language per intervention or sentence. Gracias por ayudarnos a crear este espacio multilingüe. Thanks for helping us create this multilingual space. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Lars. Welcome back, everyone, to the office hours session on rural rental housing options for survivors. I want to thank all of you all for joining us again today to have some time to ask any additional questions that have come up since the original webinar. My name is Shenna Morris. I am the Vice President of Policy and Systems Change at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Today, I have my hair up in a bun. I am wearing glasses, and I am wearing a royal blue blouse. And I am once again joined by my partner in this effort, Natalie Maxwell with the National Housing Law Project. Natalie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Shenna. As Shenna said, my name is Natalie Maxwell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the managing attorney at the National Housing Law Project. I am a Black woman with shoulder length hair that's down, and I am wearing a black shirt today. Did I miss anything, Shenna?
I don't believe so. Sorry, I'm hopping around a couple of screens here. I don't believe you did, Natalie. All right. So again, we really wanted to provide this opportunity for you all to ask any questions that remained for you all. We wanted to answer those in real time for you all as much as possible. I believe ahead of time, we did share the FAQ document that consisted of a number of questions that were raised during the original webinar. So again, this is a space and an opportunity for you all to ask any questions. If you want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we will call on you. If you would just state your name and then pose your question, of course, being mindful of the interpretation that is happening, and we can go from there. So I'll open the floor with that.
We do hope for this to be interactive, so please raise your hand and we'll go ahead and call on you to unmute yourselves. And I'll put a link to the recording of that webinar in the chat for folks who did not have a chance to watch it. Also want to encourage folks to use the chat. So what we can do, this is Shenna speaking. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. Brittany, would you like to go ahead and share the FAQ document? And perhaps we can walk through a couple of those things. All right, assuming you folks can see this?
Yes.
Awesome.
So this is Natalie speaking. I'll take the first one. So the first question that we addressed on the FAQ was a question that we got about the difference between the 515 and 521 programs. And if folks will remember, we talked about, while we primarily talked about USDA's housing programs, since they serve rural communities. And the Section 515 housing program is the direct loan program. And for that program, eligible borrowers use the loans as a resource to develop new housing or to rehabilitate existing rental housing. So in order to make that housing even more affordable to the lowest income renters and communities, USDA also offers within to people who are living in the 515 homes, a deep subsidy, which is called the Section 528 Rental Assistance Program. And the way that program works is that for low-income renters living in 515 properties, their rent amount is capped at 30% of their income. So I'll pause here and see if there are any additional questions about either of those programs or how they work together. I see Daphne's hand if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, so I do a lot, I work for a domestic violence agency here in Fredericksburg, and one of my primary responsibility is housing location. So in order to, I don't think there's a list, but how would I find out which landlords or properties are part of the 515 so I can better serve my clients?
Thanks for that question, Daphne. That's a great question about how to locate this housing in your community. So USDA actually does keep a list online. I will put the link here in the chat so that you can search for housing that participates in their rental, in the rental housing. It includes both the Section 515 housing, as well as, we didn't talk about it in the training much, but USDA also operates farm labor housing. So if you are working with farm workers, or other migrant laborers, they may be eligible for the farm labor housing program as well. And at that website, you can search for USDA housing by state. And then once you click on the state, you can search by the name of the town, the zip code, so that you can find what is in the area. Yes, Daphne again.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Our pleasure. Are there any other questions related to the 515 program before we move on to the, or, generally, before we move on to the next question? Okay, I don't see any. So the next question that we addressed on the FAQ was about the use of Social Security numbers as an eligibility requirement for 515 housing. And the simple answer is USDA does not require Social Security numbers for someone to be eligible for their housing. This is, I think, part of the confusion around that is that if you are familiar with some of the other federal housing programs, especially those administered by HUD, there are some immigration eligibility requirements for some of those programs, or citizenship requirements, but there are also a number of exceptions. And so one thing that I would encourage is if people are working with particular individuals and they have questions about eligibility, to please reach out to myself so that we can kind of walk through, because there's exceptions that get developed from time to time. And so sometimes those, the eligibility requirements might have changes. So as an example, in USDA's farm labor housing, there was some recent guidance that was issued clarifying that H-2A workers are eligible for that housing, whereas they had not previously been. But as I mentioned, in the case of the 515 housing program, there is not a citizenship or a qualifying eligible immigration status to be eligible. The eligibility requirements for that program, at least at the federal level, are based only on income. So that being said, the owners of 515 properties are allowed to establish their tenant selection criteria. So you may run into a situation where the local owner has added that as a requirement. So one thing that we have shared in the FAQ document is that if you are working with a survivor and the owner has a policy that requires the disclosure of a social security number, they are required to adjust that policy for survivors where there are safety concerns. And we have provided an example of an agreement that was reached in a fair housing complaint in a HUD case that is available publicly and that can be shared to help educate any owners that you're working with. Are there any additional questions on that topic? Okay.
Not seeing any hands. Natalie, this is Shenna speaking real quick before you move on to the next question. Again, just to remind folks or to call to people's attention that there are a number of resources that you can access at the end of the FAQ that do touch back to some of these questions that we are responding to. So even the first question around further explaining or understanding the 515 and the 521 program, we've linked a resource at the bottom of the FAQ that goes a bit further into those two programs. So I'll hand it back over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Sheena. So I see a question or a comment in the chat from Rebecca. It's a great follow-up question. If the local owner adds certain qualifying immigration status to its eligibility requirements, is that not a violation of Title VI? So that's a great observation, Rebecca. So I think it is a violation of Title VI if they are requiring that people meet a specific immigration status. It would also run afoul of the Fair Housing Act. Just one thing to note is some of this confusion has actually been caused by USDA because a lot of the owners use a handbook that USDA provides on their website. And in the handbook, it contains what is supposed to be a copy of the federal regulations that govern the USDA housing program. So at some point in the past, and I know it was the early 2000s, there was an attempt to add a requirement to add to the eligibility requirements certain immigration statuses. And so that was initially placed into the regulations. And then based on some advocacy by my predecessor at the National Housing Law Project, the agency indefinitely delayed adoption of those regulations. So that's a long way of saying they never went into effect. So if you pull up a version of the official code, there is a note that says that. And it says that those provisions do not apply. However, if you pull up a copy of USDA's handbook, it does not include that note. And so that may be a source of some of the confusion. We have been advocating for them removing that and removing that language out of the handbooks. And so the last that we heard from them, they are kind of working through their clearance process to make that change so that we don't continue to have this issue come up. Because there's not somewhere that you would go to find out, that the version that's in the handbook is not correct. So thanks for that question, Rebecca. Okay, Sheena, I think we can turn it back to you. Do you want to take the next question?
Are we at LIHTC?
We're at the emergency transfer.
Emergency transfer. Let me see. Okay, so this was the question, which is often a common question across covered housing programs, particularly when it comes to emergency transfers and how to facilitate that process. The question centered around, does the request for an emergency transfer have to be in writing? And so in the Section 515 program, the landlord or the owner must have an emergency transfer plan. And they can specify in their emergency transfer plan if the request needs to be a verbal statement, self-certification form that is used, or some type of written request in order to initiate the emergency transfer into action to begin. So again, this is a very common question that we do see around emergency transfers and how they are requested. So is there anything, did I miss anything, Natalie, that you can think of?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. And are there any follow-up questions? I'll pause there. Okay. I am going to toss the LIHTC question back over to you, as that feels more like your wheelhouse of expertise.
Absolutely. This is Natalie speaking. So on the question about the low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC properties, a very observant participant noted that LIHTC properties generally cater to higher income households at 60% AMI. And so not extremely low income folks, or frankly, folks trying to, who may not be working or have income. So the question was, how does LIHTC cater to low income requirements under the 515? And so part of this is within the 515 regulations, there are several options for how the owner sets the rent. And so one of the options, if it is a property that also has tax credit rents, is that the LIHTC rents have to be set based on the regulatory requirement. So what that means is that's kind of like a long way of saying that the tax credit rents are not necessarily going to, in and of themselves, cater to the low income requirements, but that there are other funding sources available through USDA that help, mainly the rental assistance program, which we touched on a little bit earlier. And in fact, over 75% of RD tenants living in Section 515 properties also receive rental assistance. And that is going to be the part that allows the targeting for lower income folks. So hopefully that's clear, but I will also say that if you are working with a survivor, or frankly, anybody else who's trying to access the housing program and they are having an issue with the rent amount that's been set, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to us. But I also want to provide, I think this is a good time to provide another resource. So I think Sheena and I shared that USDA is very much committed to its obligations to implement the Violence Against Women Act. And so, if you are seeing issues with survivors being able to access the property because of how the rents are being set, I'll say one place we see this is maybe at rent recertification time. Then you can reach out to their multifamily housing staff directly. So they have a 1-800 number that I will pop in the chat, as well as an email address. Where you can raise those issues directly. So I see that there is a question in the chat about, are there different immigration status requirements for tax credit than for the rental assistance that makes those affordable for low-income folks? Okay, so that's another great question. That's why I'm so glad we're doing this session. So the tax credit program also does not have immigration status requirements for that program. The one place though where there may be an issue is if you are working with a survivor who is trying to access rental assistance. So the rental assistance program that is used to further subsidize the rents does have some citizenship or qualified immigrant eligibility requirements. However, if you are serving a family where there is at least one member who has qualifying status, even if that person is the minor child, that household can still access rental assistance. So let me pause here and see if there are additional questions, especially related to what I just said, because I want to make sure I was clear, because I kind of covered a lot. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat on that one, but if something comes to folks, please feel free to raise your hands, even though we've moved on to the next question, or put it in the chat.
And really quick, before we go into the next question, just to let you all know that the 800 number, as well as the email address, we will be sure to circulate in a follow-up email with the recording, the FAQ attachment, and we'll include that information as well, so that you all have the information in one communication in one place. So no worries if you're unable to grab it from the chat. So I can take this next one, Natalie. And this was a question, we kind of heard this come up a bit earlier, I feel, about where is USDA housing, and folks mentioning that, this resource is not necessarily available in their community. So like, how can they apply for it? How do they become aware of the resource? And so in response to this question, we just shared that the new construction, like resources for the new construction of 515 housing properties has not necessarily been issued since 2011, but more so the emphasis is being placed on the preservation of the existing inventory of 515 properties. The process for 515 housing programs is a competitive process. And there is some anticipation for a call for applications to open up later this year. And so again, this is one of those places where we did provide some additional resources to allow you to kind of follow when those opportunities may present themselves. I'll also add that by accessing that information and learning more, you can really leverage that as a tool to advocate in your community for securing this type of resource for the preservation of these type of housing properties. And so I'll pause there to see if there are any follow-up questions.
Shenna, one thing that I'll just add that your comments were making me think of is if we are seeing that this housing stock is aging, and so we get notices about properties that are either up for sale or where the owner is interested. It's a similar process. It works a little bit differently through USDA, but where if the owner is interested in transferring that property to a new owner, and so even if you operate a housing program and you have no experience with the USDA housing program, there are a number of national and some regional technical assistance providers who receive funding from USDA to provide that assistance to help develop that expertise in communities so that those properties can be preserved. Because a large number of these properties were built or came online in the 80s. And so, they may have, nonprofits that are no longer able to continue kind of with their housing mission, because some of these are smaller properties, we see mom and pop owners that are also kind of have gotten older and they are, into their retirement or moving into that phase of life, but want to see that housing continue in their communities. So I think I believe at the link that's on the flyer, you can also from there kind of find information about the TA providers. But if not, I will find the list and get that to Shenna and her team to include in the follow-up materials. I should say, Shenna, I will pass it back to you. Well, maybe we should see what the next question is because I don't have a copy pulled up.
Yeah, we may want to collab on this one because this one was a question that is a bit nuanced, so to speak. And it was focusing on if people or families, migrant people or families as well, have been trafficked, are they covered then by VAWA protections? And so the nuance is that, yes, if they are a survivor of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault or stalking, and they are a recipient of assistance under one of the covered housing programs, then yes, they are indeed covered by VAWA protections. I think that nuance piece is that human trafficking itself is not protected under a VAWA grouping, unless, again, in the case that the person is a victim or survivor. Does that make sense? This might be where I tag you, Natalie, for further clarification if I'm not making sense.
I think that was perfectly clear, but I will pause and see if we have any requests for further clarification from our attendees. All right, I'm not seeing any. Thanks for the feedback in the chat, if that made sense. Okay, let's go to the next question, which is, when situations result in the survivor getting criminal charges, how does the housing provider determine whether the person claiming VAWA protections is truly the survivor and not the person using violence? And so I think there are a few important points that we make in the FAQ here, because this is something that we continuously hear about housing providers requiring proof of violence, particularly in the form of orders of protection is a big one, or some other court document. And so I think one of the most important things to just clarify is that landlords are not required to ask for documentation about the violence. They can simply take an applicant or a tenant's word that they are a survivor and that they are seeking VAWA protections. So in reality, I think what we usually see, because we are dealing with the housing context, is some sort of documentation request. And so if the landlord is asking for documentation, VAWA provides several categories that can be requested. However, the landlord cannot engage in additional fact finding to figure out if someone is a victim. Likely those actions would require the landlord to violate confidentiality, which is a central component to the VAWA protections and requirement. And so if it's a situation where the landlord is requesting documentation from the person that proves violence, that request has to be made in writing. And the person requesting the VAWA protections gets to select the form of documentation that is going to be submitted. And then there are some timeframes to process that request. So I will pause there and see if there are any questions on that, or perhaps examples that people have dealt with that they would like to ask about. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So Sheena, I will turn it back to you for the next one.
Before we move away from this one, Natalie, I was trying to find the information on the proposed rulemaking opportunity that is kind of happening in this arena right now, to share that information, to kind of put a plug there. I don't know if you have it readily available.
I don't, but I can find it. I don't know. I can add that in the chat. I don't know if you want me to say a few words about that.
That'd be great.
Okay, so HUD is currently reviewing its regulations related to its housing programs in recognition of the fact that its requirements, requirements, or what owners perceive as requirements around either denying housing to applicants or evicting tenants based on criminal activity, and that has had the impact of denying housing to large swaths of people, given the over-reliance of the criminal legal system in our country, and particularly has had a disproportionate impact on the availability of housing to Black people, people of color, people with disabilities, and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And so, so there is currently an opportunity to provide comments on the regulations to improve them so that they reduce the barriers to housing for folks. And the deadline for commenting is June 10th. And I will put in the chat the link to the HUD website where you can find additional information about how to submit a comment.
Thank you, Natalie. This is Shenna speaking. And I thought that it was important to kind of note that here as well, because we know that systems learn from each other. They model from each other. And so any ways in which we can weave survivors' experiences and voices throughout various systems and programming is always great. So I didn't want to miss that opportunity. I'm just checking to see if there are any additional questions. Okay. So our next question in the FAQ focused on, I'm sorry.
Oh, you got some Palapa? Did you want to
see
go
it.
mute?
Thank you.
Hey y'all, thank you. So my name is Palapa. I am working with I'm a housing advocate here in Ogden, in Utah. Sorry, I'm in Utah. And I'm under, my grant is specifically under rapid rehousing continuum of care. I have a question regarding landlords. So I have a specific landlord that comes to mind with all the landlord stuff. And there are some things that's been mentioned by Natalie, by both of you ladies, that just crosses my mind. For example, I personally feel, and this is just working with the same landlord for over a year, I personally feel that there's some things that she does that almost, it just seems perpetrating, as almost like she's victimizing my clients, in the sense that she knows that our agency pays for their rent. And so she gets to kind of do whatever it is that she wants. For example, I'll give you a situation. There was an incident that occurred on her property that she requested the client's police record, and then she shared it with myself and my supervisor. What are your thoughts? Like, and then she just does other things where my clients will call out for maintenance. She doesn't show up. She towed another client's vehicle and without notice. And so, like, what are some things, or what advice do you guys have?
So can you clarify? I know you said you were a housing advocate. Do you work at with one of the local centers? Are you with like a legal aid program?
Sorry, I should have clarified that. I'm with a domestic violence agency here.
Okay, great. So I have a few thoughts. One is, if it seems like the landlord is taking actions to retaliate against your client because of their status as a survivor, under the new 2022 VAWA reauthorization, they made it explicitly clear that you can bring a claim for retaliation. And it also provided an explicit complaint process through HUD's Fair Housing and Enforcement division. And so I think we have links to those on the FAQ as well. So that's, that's kind of one way, but that obviously is escalating things. Another might be, I assume that you've tried to talk with this person and provide them with some education about their problematic behavior.
Yes, and I have. I completely have. I've reached out. I've talked to her in person. I have spoken to her over the phone. And I just feel like it's not going anywhere because with the understanding that the population that we serve comes with higher barriers as far as criminal charges on their backgrounds. So therefore, I honestly feel and believe that she uses that as kind of a crutch, almost in a sense of against my clients. And so it's almost like they don't have any other choice but to deal with what she has to say and what she does. She's taken it to as far as she had evicted, or she put up a 3-day pay or vacate on a client's door. And so when I went out there, she said that the place was completely ruined, and she said that she personally witnessed the client making meth in her apartment. And then said code enforcement was out there. I called the city, spoke with code enforcement, and they said nobody ever went out to the apartment. She lied about the whole entire thing just to get my client out. So I just feel like it's just a whole bunch of retaliation, pretty much is what it is.
So if you don't already have a relationship with your local legal aid program, I would encourage you to reach out. Because if there are particular legal claims that couldn't be addressed in court, they can provide that assistance. And then there's just the kind of the practical resolution, which is, it sounds like this particular landlord probably does not need to be engaged in providing housing, frankly, to anybody, let alone a survivor. But I will pause there, see if Sheena has any other practical considerations to share.
Well, I had two questions, Philippa. One is just to confirm, this is a private landlord, so it's not a corporation or anything like that. Is that correct?
It's an actual corporation.
Okay, so is she like the property manager?
Correct.
So it's not the private owner. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify there. And then, okay. And then with it being a corporation, is this kind of like the main game in town, the primary?
I would say so. And I've
Mhm.
asked her if I could speak to someone other than herself, a supervisor, someone in their headquarters. And she said, nope, I'm the boss. So I've taken it to our executive director, and we've spoken about it, and we're trying to mediate some things in between that, and we're trying to keep it within house. And we've scheduled a meeting with the landlord, or with this manager, to come in, and so we can kind of allow her the information that we have as far as like what we do for our clients after the fact, that I've already completed all this with her. So we're trying to still mediate some things, but the hope is that we can, I don't know, honestly, she shouldn't be a landlord. That's just my personal opinion, but
Yeah, the only additional thing that comes to mind is in my recalling from doing rapid rehousing with landlords here in Georgia when I was at the state coalition, was in those times when we did have said challenges, because we did experience times as well where landlords would be very judgmental, would be retaliatory, was to kind of escalate those incidents to kind of like the more corporate office, which was then more responsive and more amenable to kind of working with us through things as they did arise. So that's the only additional thing that comes to mind, in addition to the points that Natalie shared about the other alternative routes. And please if, please don't hesitate to reach out as you all continue to try to navigate through this. I see Daphne, I think, you have your hand raised. Uh-oh, you're on mute. You're still on mute, Daphne.
Hello, can you hear me now? I'm sorry about that. So what I want to go back towards the question about the criminal charges for a person who's trying to move into a place and the leasing manager or whomever says, okay, well, we need that documentation. So I'm curious about what that process truly looks like. And if you guys had any experience with that, can you share what happened when a person has challenged this, when a person has challenged not being approved because of an assault that they may or may not have committed due to, well, mainly committed due to domestic violence?
So if we are talking, this is Natalie speaking.
Yes, ma'am.
If we are talking about a VAWA covered housing provider, their HUD has provided guidance that around kind of how to explicitly look at and analyze how if there's criminal history that is connected to being a survivor. And the guidance is very clear that should not be considered as a basis for denying an applicant housing in a covered housing program. How that actually happens in real life varies widely among housing providers. So I've seen where you have a covered housing provider where they have never heard of VAWA. And so what they just provide a denial letter. And we have a survivor who knows their rights, who's working with an advocate. They will follow up, provide some education about the VAWA requirements, and ask for the application to be reconsidered and accepted. So that's, not the best case, not the worst case. I mean, you have others kind of on the worst case in where VAWA doesn't apply and they're not going to consider anything else.
Right.
And so in those situations, I would encourage people to definitely use the new complaint process, HUD's complaint process, to file a complaint. And then there are other housing providers that understand what their VAWA obligations are. As part of that denial of the application, they provide the VAWA notice rights that explain that if you have been, if you're a survivor of domestic or sexual violence, that you can appeal the decision and provide, mitigating information, and then engage in that process. So it definitely varies.
This is Shenna speaking, and just to add on top of what Natalie shared from kind of like the another lens on top of the formalities of kind of taking these routes, I feel like this example also speaks to, again, the importance of outreach and advocacy and education efforts to really help landlords to understand the dynamics of domestic violence, dating violence, and what have you, beyond just what their like responsibilities are from that formal standpoint, but that they truly understand those dynamics, which may lead to a person having a criminal record or some type of activity that shows up.
Thank you.
I'm conscious of the time. It's about 4 minutes before 4 o'clock. And you all have been very engaged with follow-up questions as we have been going through the FAQ. It looks like we have there are several more questions left. I don't recall if we were an hour. Do you recall, Natalie or Brittany?
Just an hour today.
Okay. And so again, we have already and will be following up again with providing this information. But I want to see if there are any other kind of pressing questions that people may have that they want to bring in these last few minutes versus perhaps going through another question on the FAQ. So I'm going to pause there to leave some space. Okay. Hearing none, and Brittany, it looks like you may have read my mind that both Natalie and I can drop our contact information here in the chat, and absolutely welcome you all to reach out as you continue to review the FAQ. And if additional questions come up, the presentation will be sent out as well, the information. And if you recall, the recording of the previous session is also available where we dived into this conversation a bit further. So I want to thank you all for joining us again today and have a great rest of your day. Let me pop my email in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.